Father in heaven, you are King. We are ruled by a living God, not a future king, not a distant king, not a king who is just a figurehead, but a king who is active and wants us to live as people ruled by what sort of king you are. And as we learned a little bit about that this morning, I pray you would teach us, show us who you are, show us what sort of king you are, and what sort of people belong to your kingdom. Amen. So this song, I didn't plan on saying this, but it's actually very, very relevant. And this song is one that I never really pay much attention to because it's sort of, it's kind of this classic, older kind of tune, and it doesn't capture the way my brain works. Like I kind of doze off a little bit with kind of the pace of it, and maybe some of you are like that with certain types of music. There's nothing wrong with the song, but it's just the way I interact with it. But the words are just so remarkable. And I never really paid attention to that. And as we were singing, and I was thinking about this one verse, these two lines, though the wrong seems off so strong, we're going to see that today in Judges. The wrong seems very strong. God is the ruler. He is. It's present tense. He is the ruler. And then it says, Jesus who died shall be satisfied. The idea of Jesus being satisfied is that his death actually was worth it. That he died for something that was worth dying for. And then it says, and earth and heaven be one. Something that I've been working on quite a bit lately, and partly it's in preparation for, I'm just moving this because it's blinding my eyeballs as the light hits this shiny metal. Preparing for Acts and preparing for some of the topics in Paul's writings, and one of the topics is eschatology. Eschatology is, we commonly think of it as the study of end times. That's not really what it meant to the original, like the early church. They wouldn't have thought of eschatology as end times things. It's sort of last things, but more accurately, it's sort of a progression. The idea of eschatology is a progression of God's rule becoming increasingly known in creation. Increasingly known. And of course, when Jesus returns, then his presence will be fully known. His work will be fully known and complete. And so this idea of end times things and last things has been quite a heavy topic in the last 100 years. There have been many events in the world that have made us wonder, are we living in the last days? Are we living in the end times? And of course, lots of books have been written, and there's been a pretty heavy obsession with this topic. And along with that has been the propagation of different ideas of what that'll look like. And one of those ideas, and it comes from something that Paul wrote, and I'll address that in more detail later in that Acts series, but it's this idea that Jesus is going to come down from heaven, and those who are faithful, those who believe in him, will meet him in the sky. And then what? The common belief is we're going to go with him somewhere else, not here. But that's not what Paul meant. He's using allegorical or illustrative language that in the Greek and in his original audience would have immediately grasped what he meant, because these words they get translated into English, and then English changes, and we start to understand them differently. And this is what happened in the last couple hundred years, this idea of rapture, that we're going to be raptured and taken away from this planet into heaven. But this line in this song is right. Earth and heaven are going to be one. And we're going to meet Jesus, but just like in the ancient times, if a king was coming to your city, you wouldn't just sit in your house and wait for the king to come. That would have been very disrespectful. You go out and meet him. You have a big ceremony. You have a big trumpets, and you have all kinds of excitement. You go out, and then you come in, and you bring him in and host him in your city. And that's the imagery that Paul was talking about. We meet him, and the idea of him coming down is kind of a tricky image. It's not literally coming down from heaven, but he's going to make himself visibly known to us, and we're going to meet him, and we're going to welcome him to our home, our home and his home. This has been the goal all through history, and this is the goal in the entering in the promised land. In God bringing the Israelites into the promised land, his goal was to set up a home there with them. He wanted to establish a kingdom on earth that showed what sort of king he is. And because they just couldn't ever get their act together, what needs to happen is humanity needs to be changed. We need to be changed so that we actually can love and honor the king that God actually is. And so the plan that God has is to make this earth his eternal home, our eternal home, whatever that'll look like. We don't have clarity on what that'll look like, but it will be this place. And so that's our hope. And as we continue to go through the story of God and his people, that's what it's leading toward. And the idea that God wants us to establish a home for him here. And that's what we do as the church, is that we make a home for him among us. And so how do we know when he's among us? How do we know, what's the evidence? And this is something that bothers me sometimes, because I just think in my own life, what's the evidence that I'm actually in relationship with God? What's the evidence that sometimes I don't, I have a hard time hearing God's voice, and I have a hard time communicating with him, and it feels a bit distant. But there can be evidence in our lives that even though we don't feel it, that he is present. I love in the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, he has a way of bringing scriptural truth into his stories and presenting it in a way that is unsuspecting. It's like, oh yeah, that's actually biblical, right? You're in the story, and it's like, no, that comes from Scripture. And this is one of those things in the last book of the trilogy, The Return of the King. There's several of the characters are close to death. They're looks like they're not going to make it. They're sick. And Gandalf has sent for Aragorn, explaining that it is only in the coming of Aragorn that any hope remains for the sick. And then Ioreth, a wise woman of Gondor, spoke an ancient proverb, and this is what she said: "The hands of the king are the hands of a healer." The hands of the king are the hands of a healer, and so shall the rightful king be known. The hands of the king are the hands of a healer, and so shall the rightful king be known. We know that the king is ruler of our life when healing happens. And it's not always physical healing of sickness or disease, but healing of relationship, healing of our own self-destructiveness, of our own patterns of behavior. Things become more increasingly like the king in our lives when he is our ruler. But this is not what's been happening in Israel. The experience of living in the promised land has not been all they imagined. There's a significant darkness and heaviness in the book of Judges, and it's getting darker as we go along. And I just can't help but wonder, what has happened? What has happened to Israel? Like I'm reading this story and I'm thinking, like, where's the tabernacle? Where's the majestic events of the celebrations and the festivals that they were supposed to participate in? Where's the priests? What are they doing? What's going on? But it says at the end of Judges in 21 verse 25, in those days there was no king in Israel. They had no king. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. This is what has happened. They aren't being ruled. They don't have a king. And so we're entering now what is a low point in Israel's history, and I don't mean to, put a downer on the middle of summer and a long weekend, but this one's a little bit of a downer. It's a little bit sad, and it's heavy, and we should feel some tension. And so this isn't meant to discourage us or to make us feel down, but just for us to acknowledge what can go wrong when we don't have a king, when we aren't ruled by a good king. From the end of Judges chapter 8 and then basically to the end of the book, it seems like there's little hope for Israel, little evidence that Israel is actually this holy chosen nation, this people picked out of all the people in the world by Yahweh to be his people, to represent him in the world. And it doesn't look like that at all. It looks like they've become pretty much like every other nation, behaving the way that everyone else behaves. In the days of Gideon, after he delivered Israel from the oppression of the Midianites, the people were desperate for a king. Rightly so. They had no one to lead them. Moses and Joshua, pretty decent leaders. They represented God as best they could. But now they don't have anyone like that. They're supposed to make God their king. They're supposed to be ruled by him. But it seems like they can't quite do it. They want a ruler who will reunite them, that will unite them around a national identity. They want a ruler, a king who will represent their God to them, a king who will set up an organized military and make deals with neighboring rulers. And Gideon seemed like a good fit. He seemed like the right kind of person to become their king. And so in Judges chapter 8, starting at verse 22, the Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." See, they wanted to set up a monarchy, a dynasty, where Gideon would be their king, and then when he died, then his son would take over, and it would set up this dynastic kingdom. And the reason they gave is because Gideon, they said, saved them. Was it Gideon actually that saved them? No, it was God that saved them. Gideon was terrible. He did eventually do what God said, but very reluctantly. And really, he didn't do much because God went before them and reduced the power of Gideon and his army to basically nothing, to prove that it was actually God that was saving them. But they said, so the criteria was that the one that they want to make king is the one that saved them. Well, Gideon says, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. Yahweh will rule over you." You see, it was actually God who saved them. So if the one who saved them should be king, then it should be God to rule them. He should be king. And so it seems like Gideon has the right response here. Like, he's on the right track. Like, wow, he's He's grown up. His faith has increased. He's more devoted to God. But it's too good to be true, unfortunately. We quickly learn that it's not so much out of reverence for God that he denies this appointing to be king. Turning to his cowardly ways, he aims to appease the people. See, he knows they need something tangible, something or someone that they can point to and say, this is who we serve, this is the representative of our God. And so that's what he does. He sets something up for them. And so he says, I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder. It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. They answered, we'll be glad to give them. So they spread out a garment, and each of them threw a ring from his plunder onto it. And so what he did next was he took the gold and he made something called an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there. So basically, he took the gold and he created an idol. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? This happened at Mount Sinai. Israel was waiting for Moses, and it was taking too long, so they said to Aaron, make us a god. Where is our God? We need a God. And so Aaron said, okay, give me your gold, and then threw it in the fire, and out came this calf. According to him, that was how it went down. But he created a God for them because they were just completely lost without some tangible way of connecting with their deity. And so this is what Gideon did. He didn't push back on them. He didn't insist that they find a way to make Yahweh their king. He instead turned to the ways that all the rest of the nations do things, and he made this idol. And he basically probably was reconstructing a shrine that he previously had torn down, which we read about in chapter 6. And he originally tore it down because God told him to. And they were in a position at that point where they were desperate. And one of the conditions, one of the expectations that God had was, well, if I'm going to help you, you have to tear down this shrine. So Gideon did it. Well, now they're rescued. All is well. So up goes the shrine again. Perhaps they thought if we had a king or we had some sort of object, some sort of place where we could worship our God, where we could consult our God in a proper way, then maybe this wouldn't happen again. I think they're forgetting that God actually gave them that. I'm wondering too, where is this tabernacle? Why aren't they using that as the place to worship their God? Why do they keep going to these idols? And it goes all the way back to God's warning that if you don't remove all of the infrastructure of idolatry from the land, they're going to become a snare to you. And that's exactly what's been happening. They're constantly tempted to go back to their former ways. And so Gideon doesn't want to be king. He sets something up to make them happy so they won't be mad at him and kill him. And it becomes problematic for Gideon, for the whole nation. And though they experience 40 years of rest, not because they deserve it, but because God decided to let them recover from oppression. And so they had 40 years of rest, but their unrepentant and blatant neglect of God leads them to once again experience the hand of God being removed from them. God removed his protection. But the form of oppression is different this time. It's not from an outside force, but from within. And it's a taste of what will become a common pattern once Israel finally does get the king that they are demanding. So we're going to go through this story a little bit piece by piece, and we're not going to dwell too much on the details, but just to give us an overview of what's happening here with Abimelech, who establishes himself as a king. So Judges 9 begins this way. Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, so Jerubbaal is another name for Gideon, went to his mother's brothers. So remember, Abimelech is a half-brother. He's the son of a concubine that is in Shechem. So he went to his mother's brothers in Shechem and his uncles, and it said to them and to all his mother's clan, "Ask all the citizens of Shechem, which is better for you, to have all 70 of Jerubbaal, Gideon's sons, rule over you, or just one man? Remember, I am your flesh and blood." When the brothers repeated all this to the citizens of Shechem, they were inclined to follow Abimelech. For they said, "He is related to us." They gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal-berith, and Abimelech used it to hire reckless scoundrels who became his followers. He went to his father's home in Ophrah, and on one stone murdered his 70 brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, escaped by hiding. Then all the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo gathered beside the great tree at the pillar in Shechem to crown Abimelech king. There's so many details in here, and it may be confusing. Like, who are these people? What's going on? I can fill you in if you're really curious, but essentially what's happening is Abimelech, half-brother, illegitimate son, he's got these 70 brothers. Whether that's a literal number or not sure. 70 seems to mean like a complete. Gideon has a complete family, right? Maybe literally 70, but it seems like it's more of this idea that Gideon has a complete family that will continue his rule, so to speak, not as a king, but as this judge and as this kind of figure of authority in Israel. And so there's an authority structure in place, and Abimelech feels like he should get that. He wants to have that, and he actually wants to do it in the way that the people were asking. People were asking for a king, and Abimelech says, "Well, I'll be that king." But he's illegitimate. They won't accept him. He has to. All of his brothers first have to die. Otherwise, he'll never be accepted as a king. So he goes and he gets funding from his uncles and hires a mob to kill all his brothers. So that's basically what happened. And so he's trying to establish himself as king. And so that's what happens. All his brothers are dead except one who runs away, and they crown him king. Awful. It's a graphic illustration of what humans are capable of when they grasp for power, when they feel threatened, when they feel like they can't get it any other way, and they have to have it. And the problem in this story is not purely related to the fact that there's a human who has become a king, but the manner by which he became king. Abimelech set out on a relentless and violent pursuit to take what was never given to him, what was never offered to him. And he took it through murder and manipulation. He, appealing to his mother's family, to their family pride and their community pride, to gain financial and political support. And so then what follows after that is a warning from the only survivor among the brothers, and this is what Jotham says. So when Jotham was told about this, he climbed up on the top of Mount Gerizim and shouted to them, "Listen to me, citizens of Shechem, so that God may listen to you." One day the trees went out to anoint a king for themselves. They said to the olive tree, "Be our king." But the olive tree answered, "Should I give up my oil, by which both gods and humans are honored, to hold sway over the trees?" Next the trees said to the fig tree, "Come and be our king." But the fig tree replied, "Should I give up my fruit, so good and sweet, to hold sway over the trees?" Then the tree said to the vine, "Come be our king." But the vine answered, "Should I give up my wine, which cheers both gods and humans, to hold sway over the trees?" Finally, all the trees said to the thorn bush, "Come and be our king." The thorn bush said to the trees, "If you really want to anoint me king over you, come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, then let fire come out of the thorn bush and consume the cedars of Lebanon." So, interesting parable. It's a fable, obviously not a true story, but it's based on a principle. And the essence of the message is that the people who empower a leader are equally responsible for the way things go under that leader. Okay, so I came here 3 years ago, and those of you who are here, and there's lots who weren't here, so maybe you would have decided differently, but those of you who are here decided that I should be the pastor here. And so from that point on, it is my responsibility to do that well, to lead well, but it's also your responsibility because, I'm not here by force. I didn't put myself here. You put me here, and you keep me here. And so if things go badly, then it's also your responsibility. It's my responsibility, but also yours. And that's the idea, is that if you anoint or elect or appoint a ruler who is a tyrant, who is destructive and has a terrible character and has a track record that is unsavory, then don't be surprised when his tyranny causes you to suffer. Don't be surprised. He's not going to be on your side the whole time. He's out for himself and him alone. And notice in the story how the thorn bush responds to the trees. He says, if you really want to anoint me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. To take refuge in the shade of a king is a way of saying that the king will provide protection. Now, if you think about a thorn bush, now I don't know, when I think of thorn bushes, the only thing that ever really comes to mind is rose bushes, because they have thorns, right? But there's different thorn bushes. Maybe you imagine something different. Are thorn bushes, do they provide good shade? Maybe for the weeds that grow under them. They're not you think of an olive tree, right? These big, tall things, and if people let them get that big. And you can sit under the shade. Can you sit under the shade of a thorn bush? Not very comfortably. Ouch. The thorns might poke you. But that's what he's saying. He's saying, look, you know who I am. You know what I am. I'm a thorn bush. If you really want me to be your king, then come on. Come over here and you see what it's like to sit under my shade, to be under my protection. The thorn bush knows very well what sort of shade he can provide. The implication is that the thorn bush knows full well he's not fit for this, but they don't care. They just want a king. They want someone to be in that position. Abimelech didn't hide his character. The very first thing he did when he said, "I'm going to be your king," is he asked them for money to hire a mob to kill all his brothers. So they knew what sort of king he would be. They didn't care. They just wanted a king. If someone is willing to kill his entire family to take power, then what sort of destruction is he going to bring upon those who put him in power? And they soon found out. He was ruling for 3 years, and there's no detail on what that looked like. But it says, after Abimelech had governed, this is in verse 9, verse 22, had governed Israel 3 years, God stirred up animosity between Abimelech and the citizens of Shechem, so that they acted treacherously against Abimelech. God did this in order that the crime against Jerubbaal's 70 sons, the shedding of their blood, might be avenged on their brother Abimelech and on the citizens of Shechem, who helped him murder his brothers. In opposition to him, these citizens of Shechem set men on the hilltops to ambush and rob everyone who passed by, and this was reported to Abimelech. So these people who put him in power realize, God sort of awakened. He awoke them to their folly and said, you know what? This guy's not a good king. We're going to cause problems for him. We're going to actually make things worse for him. And then Abimelech gathered together an army, attacked, destroyed Shechem and all the leaders, and then this was followed by Abimelech being killed himself. Had a millstone dropped on his head, and then, anyway, I won't go into more detail, but it was just awful, dark situation. The brief and relatively localized reign of Israel's first so-called king was a complete failure. It represented the condition of the entirety of Israel, desperate for a king, that they'll just take anyone. They were not living as people ruled by Yahweh. They allowed the seizure of power through violence, and it created conditions for the establishment of a ruler who had no interest in honoring their God. Abimelech pursued kingship driven purely by personal ambition, lacking any legitimate claim or mandate from God or even a pressing national need. They really had no need for a king. They just felt like they did. And he consolidated power by recruiting these morally compromised people, paying them to serve his purposes. And it ended the way it began, with violence. But Israel's demand for a king persisted. Fast forwarding to 1 Samuel 8, it shows that Israel was insistent on having a human king. And Samuel was warning them. God was warning Israel through Samuel. Here's what's going to happen. You will be better off if I rule you than if a human king rules you. And he warned them what's going to happen. And it says, but the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, we are determined to have a king over us, so that we may also be like other nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. They were, like the way that I read this and the way that I hear this is, they were embarrassed by their God. They were embarrassed that their God didn't give them a king. All the other gods of all the other countries, they give them kings. Why don't you give us a king? What's the problem? But Yahweh's not like the other gods. He actually has a plan. The other gods, they just sort of exist. You know, in those days, gods didn't really have plans that they made known to people. They operated with a sort of symbiosis, a symbiotic relationship, like where there's mutual benefit. That's the idea in the ancient times is, well, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. You're more powerful, so I get more from you. So I understand if you decide you don't want to give me, stuff. So I'll make more sacrifices and maybe make you happy, but sometimes my sacrifices actually make you angry, and I don't know what's going on. And that's sort of the world they lived in. They never really knew what the gods wanted from them. And so they tried everything. A common tactic was to have a king who apparently had a closer relationship with this deity than everybody else. They had a special place. And often they would choose places where they would have their kingdom or their throne, or they would have these special places where the veil was thinner between the divine and earth. And they would have these ways of communicating with the gods. And Israel was treating Yahweh like this. They were treating their God like this. They didn't want to do things God's way. They had their own plans and ideas. Why would they want a God who has plans? They had their own plans. They just wanted their God to provide what they needed to be successful, so that they could succeed as a legitimate nation, respected, respectable. And so they thought that in order to do this, they had to have a king. And God did eventually provide a king. And during the reign of King David, who really was the only really good king they ever had, while David was ruling, God made a promise to David. He said, "From your descendants, I will raise up a king who will rule Israel forever. It'll be an eternal kingdom. From your descendants will be a king that will make all things right, that will bring everything back to the way it should be." The problem was that Israel interpreted this promise through their original desires. All they heard was, our God is going to finally give us the king we've always asked for, a king who will make us an eternal, strong kingdom that will never be threatened, that will never be destroyed. This king will restore national power and military dominance and political independence. Finally, we are going to be a kingdom above every other kingdom. They sought a political solution to a spiritual problem. They could only understand things in terms of what they saw in the other nations and how that was all set up. And they thought this eternal kingdom ruled by an eternal king would look like one of those, but better. But that's not what the promise was. And that's not what happened. You see, humans make bad rulers because we're imperfect. As soon as we get a little bit of power, we use it for our own purposes. We become selfish. We become inwardly focused. We have a spirit of rebellion and pride. But what would a perfect human king look like? What would it look like if this eternal king was actually never tempted to take power for his own purposes? What if there was a perfect person, someone who was never self-seeking, was always making decisions based on what is best, not just for the kingdom of Israel, but for the whole world? Who would not manipulate or murder in order to gain power? Who would represent God's holiness in every word spoken and every deed done? Whose justice is incorruptible? If Israel would have submitted themselves to Yahweh, this is what it would have looked like. This is what sort of king God is. But we humans have a hard time comprehending a king we cannot see and hear. We want a visible king, one with a palace and a courtyard and a throne room. One of those evil or medieval throne rooms, right, Zane? A medieval throne room. Glorious. Israel failed to allow Yahweh to establish this kingdom in his way. They wanted what the other nations had, and when they got it, it destroyed them. But God is faithful. He promised a king, and he keeps his promises. This eternal king rose to power through perfect obedience to God, never seeking the power for himself, never seeking the throne so that he could be above all, so that he could be the object of everyone's fearful obedience, but because it would bring benefit to the whole creation. And he set up a throne unlike any other. It wasn't one of those medieval thrones. It is a throne in the shape of a Roman cross. And in the eyes of a world grasping for power, this throne looks like weakness. But is it weakness or is it true power when you stand in the presence of your enemies and forgive them as they kill you? It is the purest form of power because the true enemy is not those who want to kill you. The true enemy is death itself. And so we and our enemies have a common enemy, and we both need rescuing from that enemy. And the eternal King promised by God, he is a king that raises the dead. And so when we face our enemy, our true enemy, which is death itself, we can take it. Take everything that it can throw at us. And it will kill us. But our King raises the dead. And this is the hope that we have. This is the hope that is not just based on a future reality, but a present reality. A hope that when we don't get healed, when we don't get rescued from the danger we're in, we can face death and say, bring it on. My King raises the dead. Let's pray. Father in heaven, you have been faithful in keeping your promise to give us a king who rules perfectly. And I pray that we would accept his rule over us. Thank you that we don't do this on our own strength, but it is by the very power of the death and resurrection of Jesus that we're able to experience what it's like to want to obey you, to desire your rule. I pray that transformation takes a hold of each one of us. Amen. We're going to conclude our service with communion. And as you come up,